On the day I gave birth to my child via C-section, my husband made a sudden, shocking confession. He told me he already had a son. He suggested that, to avoid any complicated legal or child support issues for the time being, we should leave his name off the birth certificate and register the baby using my parents' address. I didn't get angry. I didn't scream. I just calmly nodded. 5 days later, when my husband came to the county hospital to discharge me, I put into motion a plan that would leave him and his entire family in absolute shock. That day, I was lying on the operating table. My abdomen had just been sutured, and the anesthesia hadn't fully worn off, leaving a cold sweat dripping down my spine. My husband, Brandon, stood near my head. His voice was low, but it was cold enough to push my heart off the deepest cliff. He confessed that he already had a son out there. Therefore, to avoid messy paperwork, he said it would be better to just use my parents' address and handle the legalities later. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't cry or yell. I just stared straight into his eyes. My gaze lingered for so long that he visibly panicked. Then, very slowly, I nodded. It was as if this was the most mundane, everyday occurrence in my life. The nurse beside me paused for a second but quickly turned away, pretending she hadn't heard a thing. I closed my eyes and let my tears flow inward. It wasn't because I was weak, but because I realized in that exact moment that everything was over. I just hadn't chosen exactly how to end the relationship yet. My name is Natalie. I am 28 years old and have been married for 3 years. Up until now, I had never once talked back to my mother-in-law. I never gave the neighbors any reason to gossip, believing that if I simply lived a good, kind life, my family would be peaceful and without problems. But my kindness only became an excuse for others to look down on me. Brandon met me when I was working as an accounting clerk at a medium-sized furniture manufacturing plant in our Midwestern town. Back then, he seemed incredibly sweet. His tone was gentle, and he constantly told me I was the only woman he ever wanted to marry. I had never loved anyone so deeply before, and I didn't know a man could say such reassuring things, so I believed him wholeheartedly. On our wedding day, my mother-in-law, Mrs. Preston, held my hand tightly in front of all our relatives and said, "Our family doesn't need a hotshot, overly ambitious daughter-in-law. We just need someone who knows her place, takes good care of her husband and mother-in-law, and knows how to raise children." I nodded, making a firm promise to myself. I thought that if I just had patience as a daughter-in-law, everything would go smoothly. But within a year, I realized that knowing my place didn't mean being kind. It meant absolute, unquestioning submission. Brandon frequently traveled out of state for sales accounts. Once he left, he'd be gone for a week, sometimes 15 days at a time. I kept my job while managing all the household chores and making sure my mother-in-law's meals were prepared, never uttering a single word of complaint. Then, one day, I happened to overhear my mother-in-law quietly talking on the phone in the kitchen. Her voice was hushed, but every word pierced clearly into my ears. "Yes, my son is sending the allowance regularly, right? That boy is so smart. His mother raised him well. He's completely different from our Natalie's background. All right, that's enough for now." I froze in the doorway, holding a basket of unwashed vegetables. My mind went blank. I couldn't understand who my mother-in-law was talking about, but my intuition warned me that something was terribly wrong. That night, when Brandon called, I asked him directly, "Brandon, do you happen to have another child out there?" A heavy silence lingered over the phone for a few seconds. Then, he let out an awkward laugh. "You really come up with the craziest imaginations." I didn't press further. I just mumbled, "Oh, okay," and hung up. But after that day, I became hypersensitive to everything. Things I had previously overlooked started catching my eye. The fact that the living expenses he sent home were absurdly low compared to what he claimed to earn. How he subtly changed the subject whenever I brought up having kids. And the realization that the way my mother-in-law looked at me wasn't with affection, but with cold, calculating judgment. Then, I got pregnant. I thought this joyful news would change everything, that the baby's existence would bind our family closer together, and that Brandon would come home more often. I was wrong. During my entire pregnancy, he came home exactly twice, and each time he stayed for less than 2 days before leaving again, always using work as an excuse. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law began openly expressing her dissatisfaction. She nagged me for eating too much, sleeping too much, and moving too slowly. She even said to my face once, "If you give birth to a son, your value might go up a bit, but otherwise, you're nothing special." It felt like my heart was being shredded, but I kept my mouth shut, thinking only of my baby's health. The due date arrived. My contractions started in the middle of the night, and I was rushed to the county medical center. The doctor said the fetal heart rate was unstable and I needed an emergency C-section immediately. With trembling hands, I signed the consent forms. Not because I was scared of the surgery, but because I was terrified something would happen to my baby. The surgery took over an hour. When I woke up from the anesthesia, the first thing I heard was my baby's cry, a small but clear sound. I smiled. I cried tears of happiness, but right after that, Brandon's confession shattered my entire world. I didn't ask why he hid it for 3 years, how old the boy was, or who the mother was. I knew that whatever answer I got would only deepen the wound. During the 5 days I spent recovering in the hospital, he didn't visit my room a single time. Only my mother, who had driven down from her quiet suburban home, stayed by my side. She looked at me with red, swollen eyes but asked nothing. She just silently held her grandchild and fed me warm chicken stew and mashed potatoes. Occasionally, I could hear her faint sighs. On the 4th night, after the baby fell asleep, my mom sat by my bed and whispered, "Natalie, if your heart is heavy, you can always come back home." I looked into my mother's eyes for the first time in years. I couldn't nod right away. After a long silence, I asked, "If I don't go back to that house, won't you be heartbroken for me?" My mom stroked my hair gently. A mother only wishes for her daughter not to live in pain. Those words kept me awake all night. Not because of the pain from the incision, but because I realized I had suppressed and endured for far too long. On the morning of the 5th day, Brandon finally arrived. When he walked into the room for the first time, his face was infuriatingly peaceful, as if he had never spoken those soul-crushing words to me. He glanced at the baby and said, "Get your things together. I'll take you home." I nodded, just like in the operating room, very slowly. But this time, a firm resolve had settled in my heart. I held my baby, looking down at that tiny face, and my mind instantly found peace. Then I turned to Brandon and said very calmly, "Yes, let's go home." He had no idea that the word home would mark the beginning of something he and his family could never have imagined. He didn't know that the moment we stepped out the front doors of the hospital, my actions would leave everyone speechless. I walked out of the room holding the baby. My steps were slow but steady. Every movement made my incision throb, but strangely, my mind was perfectly quiet. Compared to the betrayal I had just experienced, physical pain felt like nothing. Brandon followed behind me, carrying the diaper bag. His voice, occasionally urging me to walk a little faster, was as dry and monotonous as always. He acted as though confessing to hiding another child was a trivial matter to brush off. That very indifference was the absolute proof that, in his eyes, I had never truly been his wife. As we reached the hospital's main entrance, the morning sun began to shine. People were coming and going, cars bustling about. I took a deep breath of the air, mixed with the faint smell of exhaust typical of our town. I wanted to draw a clear boundary between the past and what was about to happen. Brandon unlocked his SUV and looked back at me. "Hurry up and get in. We need to get home early so you can rest." But I didn't move. I stood perfectly still. Holding my baby tightly with both arms, I didn't avoid his gaze. I looked him dead in the eye. He frowned in confusion and asked again, "Why aren't you getting in?" At that exact moment, I slowly took out my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I had saved the night before. My voice didn't shake, and it wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for him to hear. "Dad, I'm all done with the discharge paperwork. Can you come pick me up now?" A brief silence followed, and then my father's firm voice came through. "Yeah, Dad's on his way right now." Brandon froze. His hand holding the car keys stiffened as he stared at me in disbelief. He lowered his voice and demanded, "Why the hell are you calling your dad?" I answered shortly, "Because I'm going to my home." There was no anger or blame in that sentence, just a blade-like finality that left him unable to react. I turned my head, refusing to look at him any longer, and fixed my gaze solely on my sleeping baby. Just 15 minutes later, my father's old Ford sedan pulled up in front of the hospital. My dad stepped out of the car. He was a lean man, but his eyes were harder than ever. My mom got out of the passenger side and hurried over to take the diaper bag from me. My dad looked straight at Brandon without saying a word. That single look made the air around us pull taut. An invisible pressure seemed to crush the space between them. Flustered, Brandon forced an awkward greeting. "Good morning, sir. Ma'am, you came all this way?" My dad didn't answer him. He just turned to me and asked very gently, "Can you walk, sweetie?" I nodded, and without looking back, I walked toward my father's car. I didn't spare Brandon a single glance, as if there was nothing left to say between us. Only when I sat in the back seat did Brandon rush toward my window. His voice was laced with panic. "Natalie, what are you doing? We need to go home." I looked at him through the glass. With the coldest, most resolute expression I had ever worn in our 3 years of marriage, I asked, "Which home?" He turned to stone at the question. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I pulled my gaze away and said to my dad, "Dad, let's go." The car pulled away. Through the rearview mirror, Brandon's figure standing blankly under the sun grew smaller and smaller until he disappeared from sight. I didn't cry. I didn't look back. I just hugged my baby tighter, drawing strength from that small warmth so I wouldn't collapse. My mom sat next to me, silently holding my hand in a tight grip. She didn't say anything, but through her touch, I felt that I was no longer alone. Arriving at my parents' house, everything was exactly the same. The old small house I grew up in, the familiar porch, the quiet rustling from the backyard, all of it gave me the relief of waking up from a long, terrible nightmare. My mom hurried to warm up my old bedroom and lay out a soft blanket for the baby. My dad sat on the front porch and lit a cigarette. Like the rising smoke, he was silently calming his own heart. That afternoon, my phone rang off the hook. Starting with Brandon, then my mother-in-law, Mrs. Preston, and even unknown numbers. I ignored them all and put my phone on silent. I knew that if I picked up, I would only be dragged back into the excuses and lies I no longer wanted to hear. For the first time in my life, I chose silence to protect myself. By evening, my mother-in-law borrowed a relative's phone to call me. This time I answered. Before I could even open my mouth, her sharp voice rained down on me. "What on earth are you doing? You just had a baby and you pack up and run off to your parents? Do you even realize you are still a daughter-in-law of this family?" It was the same high-pitched, shrill voice as always, but this time, I wasn't afraid. I answered in a very calm tone. "I simply returned to the place where I belong, Mrs. Preston." She was speechless for a second, then snapped back even more aggressively. "What is that supposed to mean?" I took a deep breath, looked at my sleeping child beside me, and spoke clearly. "It means I absolutely refuse to live in a house where my husband is secretly raising another woman's child, and where the baby I risked my life to bring into the world isn't even allowed to be properly put on his birth certificate." Silence fell over the phone for a few seconds. Eventually, Mrs. Preston softened her voice slightly but still spouted her shameless excuses. "There's a backstory to all of that. Boys can make mistakes in life. To make such a big deal out of one little mistake," I let out a dry scoff. For the first time in my life, I firmly cut my mother-in-law off. A mistake is something that happens once, but meticulously hiding it for 3 years and deceiving me is not a mistake anymore. She couldn't say another word. She just muttered, "Do whatever you want then," and hung up. Putting the phone down, my heart felt infinitely lighter. The tough rope that had bound me snapped, and I felt the liberation of no longer being dragged by the past. For the next few days, I stayed at my parents' house, focusing solely on caring for my baby. My C-section scar was slowly healing, and my strength was returning. Above all, my mind became clear. Looking back over the past 3 years, I painfully confronted the countless red flags I had willfully ignored and the endless lies I had told myself to hold on to a broken marriage. I realized with absolute certainty that going back would only mean repeating the same cycle of hell. Brandon kept calling and texting. At first, he tried to explain the situation. Then he resented and blamed me. And finally, he went silent. He never once came to my parents' house. That fact only confirmed that my decision was right. If he had truly respected me as his wife, he wouldn't have let things get to this point. A week later, while I was holding the baby in the backyard, my dad walked over and sat next to me. His voice was heavy but clear. "Have you finished thinking, Natalie?" I nodded without hesitation. Yes, Dad. He looked at me for a long time before saying, then finish it properly, so that those people can never look down on you again. His words were both a permission and an immense pillar of support I had never dared to hope for before. I bowed my head, and for the first time, the tears I had held back finally fell. Not from pain, it was because I realized that from now on, I had to walk forward proudly on my own, without leaning on anyone or being tied down by anyone. I didn't know that my next move would completely blindside Brandon and his family. It was the killing blow that ensured they could no longer act with their usual shameless arrogance. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered into the yard, I sat on the porch holding my baby, watching the dew on the leaves. My mind was indescribably peaceful. After days of deep contemplation, I made a decision the old me would never have dared to imagine. I was going to end this marriage cleanly with my own hands, without waiting for any more of Brandon's excuses. I knew well that a man who deceived his wife to run a double life for 3 years wouldn't change over a few apologies. I told my mom I was heading to the county courthouse to file the paperwork. She didn't ask a lot of questions, she just told me to be careful. My dad handed me an envelope of cash, just in case I needed it for filing fees or a lawyer. I took it, promising myself to be even stronger. I wanted to prove that I wasn't divorcing by relying on my parents' money, but that I had chosen a new life with a clear mind for the sake of myself and my child. Leaving the baby with my mom, I drove to the county family court alone. The hand holding the manila envelope no longer trembled like it used to. The middle-aged clerk at the counter checked my marriage certificate and the divorce petition, then asked, "Are you absolutely sure about this?" I looked straight into her eyes and answered clearly, "Yes, I am sure." My voice wasn't loud, but it was surprisingly firm. The past version of me, who feared conflict and always yielded, was already dead and gone. When I signed the petition, the scratch of the pen on the paper sounded distinct. There was no tearing pain like I had imagined. Instead, I felt light, as if I had finally set down a massive weight that had been crushing my shoulders for far too long. Even if the road ahead was rough, I was relieved that I wouldn't have to live inside a lie anymore. When I got home that afternoon, my phone rang again. It was Brandon. I stared at the screen for a moment before hitting the answer button. I figured I needed to tie up the loose ends clearly at least once. His voice on the other end was frantic. "Where are you right now?" I answered calmly. "At my parents' house." He paused, then demanded, "I heard from your mom. Why did you go to the courthouse? What the hell are you trying to do?" I didn't beat around the bush. I filed the divorce petition. As soon as the words dropped, the phone went dead silent. A few seconds later, his voice spiked. "Are you crazy? Do you really have to blow a small issue out of proportion like this?" I let out a cold smile that felt foreign even to me. "To me, this isn't a small issue." He breathed heavily, trying to suppress his emotions. "I told you there was a backstory. Aren't you even going to give me a chance to explain?" I closed my eyes for a second. Opening them, I said slowly, "You had countless chances to be honest with me over the last 3 years, but you chose to lie to me until the very end. So now, I have the right to choose my own way." My voice was dry and devoid of malice, but it was enough to make him realize I was no longer his obedient wife. He changed his tone, starting to beg softly. "Natalie, please, just think of our baby. Let's meet and talk this out." I watched my mom's back through the screen door as she rocked the baby inside. "It's exactly because of this baby that I'm divorcing you." He had no rebuttal to that sentence. Before the call disconnected, all I heard was a heavy sigh. I thought everything would quiet down that afternoon, but I was mistaken. As the sun began to set, an expensive luxury car pulled up in front of my parents' house. It was my mother-in-law, Mrs. Preston. With a stiff face, she pushed open the gate and marched into the yard. I tried to stand up from the porch to greet her, but she ignored my gesture, looking me up and down with a sneer. "You ruthless girl, unbelievable. You gave birth mere days ago and you immediately slap us with divorce papers. Do you even care about this family's reputation? What will people at the country club say?" For the first time, I didn't avoid my mother-in-law's menacing glare. I looked right back at her and replied, "Mrs. Preston, a family's reputation isn't protected by covering up the truth." She flinched in surprise at my answer, but quickly regained her arrogance, yelling, "Any man can make a mistake. If you blow this up, you're the one who will lose out in the end." I quietly shook my head. If someone makes a mistake, they should take responsibility for it. You shouldn't force the victim to just accept it. The air in the yard turned to ice. My mom came out from the kitchen, speaking softly but firmly. "Mrs. Preston, let's take a seat on the porch. Let's talk calmly." But Mrs. Preston waved her hand dismissively. "Do you think I came here to drink tea?" She glared at me again, her voice low but piercing. "If you divorce him, how do you plan to survive dragging a newborn around? Do you even have the means?" In the past, I would have shrunk back and lowered my head at those words, but the current me answered without hesitation. "I will raise my child with my own strength." I didn't yell, but that unwavering certainty made my mother-in-law shut her mouth. Visibly flustered by the fact that I was no longer the easy pushover she could step on, she stood there fuming for a long moment. "Fine, do whatever you want," she spat, before turning around and storming out the gate. A heavy silence lingered in the yard. Strangely, I didn't feel intimidated at all. Instead, I felt as if I had smashed open a massive door I had feared for years with my own hands. That night, listening to the rhythmic breathing of my sleeping baby, I knew the path I chose wouldn't be easy. But I had no regrets. I could see a completely different future, a life where I didn't have to live in doubt and hurt, where my child wouldn't have to grow up watching his mother be disrespected. However, just 2 days later, I didn't know that another truth Brandon had been hiding would be exposed in a way that defied imagination. And that truth escalated this situation from a simple divorce to something far greater. 2 days later, while I was folding baby clothes in the bedroom, my phone rang from an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment before hitting answer. A woman's voice came through the receiver. It wasn't loud, but it was cold and clear. "Are you Brandon's wife?" I paused, then answered. "Yes, I'm Natalie." The woman didn't beat around the bush. "I'm calling because there's a truth you need to know about the child Brandon told you about." My chest went cold, not from shock, but from the premonition that the truth I had to face was far dirtier and more complicated than I knew. I stepped out to the backyard so my mom wouldn't hear and asked, "Who is this?" The woman answered very calmly. "I am that boy's mother. My name is Allison." I leaned against a wooden post, squeezing my eyes shut. "What is it you want to tell me?" Allison seemed to weigh her words for a moment before slowly speaking. "Brandon didn't tell you everything. If you've truly decided on a divorce, I thought you deserved to know the real truth." I didn't interrupt her. I just listened silently. I had a feeling that no matter how awful the truth was, now was the time to hear it all. She continued, "Our child wasn't just some accident that happened, like Brandon probably told your family. Before he even married you, we were living together like husband and wife. Our son was conceived then." In that moment, I turned to stone. My grip on the phone tightened, though I tried to keep my voice steady. "Then why on earth did he marry me?" A bitter, hollow laugh came through the phone. "His family didn't approve of me. They wanted their son to marry a more proper, obedient girl from a clean background." I leaned heavily against the post. The scattered puzzle pieces suddenly locked together into one grotesque picture. I was never a beloved wife to them. I was merely a suitable condition to save face, a perfect camouflage. Allison's dry voice continued, "I didn't call to steal your husband back. I was deceived just like you, so I thought you had the right to know the truth." I felt a bizarre sense of pity and solidarity with this woman I had never even met. It was the kinship of two women betrayed and wounded by the exact same man. I asked a few more questions, and the more I heard, the clearer it became just how horrifyingly Brandon had maintained his double life. In front of me, he played the responsible husband, while behind my back, he supported Allison and his child, acting as the real head of their household. The most sickening fact of all was that his mother, Mrs. Preston, and the rest of his in-laws knew everything from the very beginning. They had perfectly coordinated their stories to deceive me. After the call ended, I stood there for a long time. It wasn't from shock. It was the realization that my decision wasn't just the right thing to do, it was basic survival. An escape from a horrific theatrical play that was rigged against me from the start. I went back inside and stroked my sleeping baby's head. My mind felt oddly pristine. I felt like I had ripped off the very last layer of skin hiding the truth. That afternoon, I didn't hesitate to call Brandon. This time, I initiated it. He answered quickly, his voice full of hope. You called me first. I cut straight to the point. I just got off the phone with Allison. A long, heavy silence fell over the line. After a tension so thick I couldn't even hear him breathe, he finally asked in a trembling voice, What did she say to you? I answered matter-of-factly, The real truth you should have told me a long time ago. Brandon let out a rough breath, unable to hide his panic. Natalie, don't believe everything she says. I cut off his excuses and asked, Did you two live together before you married me? He couldn't answer immediately. That silence was the most definitive answer. I continued, Your mother and your whole family knew, didn't they? He let out a groaning sound and muttered, Natalie, it's not as simple as you think. I let out a small scoff. Yeah, I'm sure it's not simple, seeing as I was the only one being played for an absolute fool. He started rattling off pathetic excuses that he had no choice because his family opposed her, that he thought marrying me would make everything fall into place, that he planned to somehow make it up to me later. But none of those words reached my ears anymore. It was far too late, and I had already seen the absolute rock bottom. I cut him off. Brandon, you don't need to explain anymore. Just know that the divorce proceedings are already underway. With the sound of something crashing in the background, his voice turned desperate. Natalie, please withdraw the petition. I'll come to your parents' house right now. Let's meet and talk. I'll fix everything. I shook my head, even though I knew he couldn't see me. There's no need. My voice wasn't yelling, but it was chilling enough to freeze him to the bone. He paused, then pleaded with despair. Are you really not going to give me one single chance? I answered coldly. A chance is something you ask for before you trample on someone else's life. The call ended. I put the phone down. It felt like all the knots in my chest had been washed away. There was no lingering attachment, no more doubts. Everything was crystal clear, and all I had to do was walk the path I had chosen without looking back. That night, my dad was sitting on the porch. I brought a chair out, sat next to him, and told him everything. Listening silently, my dad nodded and said, Do you see everything clearly now? Yes, Dad. My dad stared off into the dark yard and added, In this world there are wrongs that simply cannot be fixed. It's a good thing you found out. That short, gruff comfort made me even stronger. Even if the road ahead was rocky, I was certain I would never wander in the dark again. But it didn't end there. Right after the divorce papers were served, my in-laws shifted their strategy entirely. They no longer avoided or stayed silent. Instead, they stormed my parents' house with an outrageous demand that would have completely derailed me had I lost my composure. The next morning, as I was letting the baby catch some morning sun on the porch, a car pulled up to the gate. This time, Mrs. Preston wasn't alone. She came with Uncle Henry, an elder in the Preston family, and Brandon, who had a deeply scrunched face. The confidence and arrogance in Brandon's eyes were completely gone, replaced by heavy exhaustion. I held my baby tightly to my chest and stood up. The fear I felt when my mother-in-law first visited was gone. I was ready for whatever nonsense they were about to spew. My dad came out from the house. He offered them a brief nod of acknowledgement but didn't invite them inside, nor did he outright chase them away. Meanwhile, my mom quietly brought out a few more chairs onto the porch. A suffocating tension hung between the two families. No one spoke first until Uncle Henry cleared his throat to break the ice. We came today so we could all see each other face to face and resolve any misunderstandings on good terms. It was a stiff, heavy voice, clearly rehearsed. My dad stared straight at him and answered curtly, Speak your piece. Thanks to my father's mountain-like composure, I remained unshaken. Uncle Henry looked at me and got to the point. Our family has heard all about the issues between you two. But divorce isn't child's play, especially when there's a newborn involved. You can't just break a family apart so easily. I didn't argue back. I just listened quietly. He continued. We admit Brandon made a huge mistake, but we don't believe that mistake is irreversible enough to shatter a home. The moment he finished that sentence, I understood exactly why they were there. They didn't come to apologize. They came to negotiate, to desperately glue this empty shell of a marriage back together to save their own social standing. Brandon finally spoke up. His overbearing attitude from before was gone, replaced by a subservient tone. Natalie, please, let's just talk. I looked at him. There wasn't even resentment left in my eyes, only a cold stillness. I think we've already said everything there is to say. He tried to take a step toward me, but my dad reached out a gentle yet firm arm to block him. At that quiet, resolute movement, Brandon stopped in his tracks. Unable to hold back, Mrs. Preston raised her voice again. How long are you going to be this dramatic? Aren't you thinking about your child's future? I didn't avoid her gaze. For the first time, past her icy glare, I could clearly see her anxiety and fear. It is precisely because I am thinking about my child's future that I cannot stay in that house. Speechless at my answer, she resorted to absurdity. If you just endure this, your child gets to grow up in a complete, respectable family. If you divorce and take the kid, who's going to take responsibility when people call him fatherless? I maintained my composure and shot back calmly. A father who lies to his wife and raises another kid on the side is better off absent. The yard went dead silent. Brandon dropped his head, and Uncle Henry frowned, adopting a more severe tone. Aren't you taking this a bit too far, young lady? I didn't back down. I am simply stating facts. After a brief pause, Uncle Henry changed his tune to something softer but loaded with venom. Fine. If you're going to be this stubborn, we have no intention of forcing you to stay, but we need to settle the issue of the child right now. I had expected this, but I asked anyway. What do you mean? Uncle Henry stared right at me. Our family intends to take custody of this child. Whatever happened, he has Preston blood and he is the heir to our family. The second I heard those words, I hugged my baby so tight my arms ached. It was pure instinct to protect the most precious thing in my life from being stolen. Before I could even open my mouth, my mom stepped in. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was as cold as frost. Natalie carried and birthed this child in agony. This is Natalie's child. Natalie makes the decisions regarding the baby. Mrs. Preston flared up. What are you talking about? Why should my own grandson be raised in someone else's house? My mom glared right back at her. When my daughter was risking her life in the operating room having this baby, did a single person from your family even show their face? That piercing question turned my mother-in-law mute. I felt a lump in my throat too, because it was an undeniable, irrefutable fact. Finally, Brandon looked up. His voice cracked. Natalie, I'm not saying I'm going to take the baby away by force, but at the very least, put him legally under my custody. I looked at him and asked very slowly, why? He avoided my eyes and mumbled, so that the kid's future is guaranteed. I shook my head. Are you talking about the kid's future, or your own reputation? He had no answer. I hammered the final nail. On the day I gave birth, lying on the operating table, who was the one who told me things were too complicated and asked me to secretly leave his name off the certificate and use my parents' address? That was you, Brandon. And now you're talking about legal custody? Do you think I'd ever allow that? The atmosphere grew as cold as thin ice. Uncle Henry rubbed his temples, seemingly calculating his next move, then spoke heavily. If you act like this, the one who will ultimately suffer is the child. With unwavering eyes, I stared at him and said clearly, the greatest suffering for a child would be growing up and finding out how his mother was treated in that house. Though I didn't shout, those words shut the mouths of everyone from the Preston family. My dad, who had been silent the whole time, finally spoke. His voice was low but heavy as a boulder. Our daughter has already made her decision. As her parents, we fully support it. We know far better than you who should raise and take responsibility for our grandchild, so there is nothing more to discuss. He didn't speak long, but the weight of his words left no room for rebuttal. Brandon looked at me with desperate eyes and squeezed out, Then what the hell do you want to do? I answered without a single ounce of hesitation, We follow the law. I will raise my child. If you want to fulfill your obligation as a biological father, send child support according to the court order. I don't need anything else. That statement completely shut down any pathetic attempts at further negotiation. The meeting ended in heavy silence. Mrs. Preston couldn't say another word and turned to leave first. Uncle Henry gave a slight nod and walked away. Brandon stood in the yard for a moment, looking back and forth between me and the baby, but eventually, he too turned his heavy steps away without leaving a single word. When the gate closed, I finally collapsed onto the porch. A wave of exhaustion washed over me, as if all the energy had been drained from my body, but my heart was lighter than ever. I had protected the most precious thing in my life, and I had proven that I would never let anyone dictate my life again. However, After this meeting, an unexpected situation unfolded regarding the divorce petition I had submitted. This situation forced Brandon back to my doorstep not to persuade me, but cornered at the edge of an unavoidable cliff. 3 days after that suffocating standoff, I was nursing my baby on the porch when a court mediator from the county family court called. The divorce papers had been filed properly, but because the gap in our positions regarding child custody and asset division was so wide, both spouses were required to attend a mandatory mediation hearing. The mediator's voice was professional and smooth, but my instincts kicked in. I realized I had to face Brandon again, not as husband and wife, but as opposing parties in a legal ring. I explained the situation to my dad. He nodded silently and said shortly, "If you have to go, go and finish it properly." My mom looked at me with worried eyes, urging me not to get swept up in emotions and to respond calmly. I knew it too. This was no longer an emotional battle. This was a real war to protect my child's rights using facts and the law. I could not afford to be weak anymore. The next morning, I left the baby with my mom and headed to the county courthouse with my dad. The weather was clear, but my mind was like a tightly drawn bowstring, not from fear, but because I knew this meeting would determine so much of my future. Arriving in the courthouse hallway, Brandon was already there. He stood leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets. The arrogant, confident man from the past was nowhere to be found. He looked miserable. Seeing me, he hesitated as if he had something to say, but ended up just giving a slight nod. I met him with a dry gaze and gave a curt nod back. We were guided into the mediation room. The mediator sat across the table with a stack of files. She looked back and forth between us and started, "I called you both here to confirm your final stances on a few key issues before this moves to trial." Hearing her neutral, professional tone, I felt a sense of relief that I could finally end this exhausting emotional cycle through an objective measure. The mediator carefully asked and recorded details about the length of the marriage, our residence, and joint assets. When we reached the section on child custody, she looked up and asked, "Have the two of you reached an agreement regarding legal and physical custody of the child?" Before I could even answer, Brandon spoke first. "I want full custody." I turned my head to look at him, not out of shock, but out of sheer disbelief that even when backed into a corner, he still had the audacity to be this selfish. I countered in the calmest voice possible. "The baby is a newborn. This is a time when the absolute care of a mother is necessary." Brandon looked at me and pleaded desperately. "We can hire professional nannies, and my family's financial environment is much better for raising a child." Without raising my voice, I answered clearly, "There is nothing in this world that can replace a biological mother's care." The mediator looked between us and asked Brandon, "Does the husband have concrete evidence to prove that your environment is superior for raising the child?" Brandon hesitated before answering, "My family is extremely financially stable." The mediator jotted something down, then looked at me. "And the wife?" I answered without hesitation. "I have a job I can return to, and I have the firm support of my parents to help with childcare. Most importantly, from the moment this child was born until now, I have been the one feeding and caring for him every single day without missing a beat." The air in the mediation room grew heavy. This was no longer an argument appealing to emotions. It was a sharp legal battle based on evidence. Brandon began to look visibly panicked. This wasn't a place where he could just gloss things over with vague excuses. The mediator threw a sharp question at Brandon. During the wife's pregnancy and the childbirth, did the husband directly care for the mother and child? That question was a dagger straight to the heart of the dirty truth Brandon had been hiding. Brandon shut his mouth like a mute. I answered for him. "No, not once." My voice wasn't loud, but it echoed clearly through the small room. The mediator nodded and drew a line on her paperwork. These circumstances become very crucial determining factors when a judge makes a ruling on custody. I felt relieved inside, not because I was winning, but because I was certain the law would recognize that I was the only person who hadn't left my child's side for a single second. As the mediation was wrapping up, the mediator looked at Brandon. "Does the husband have anything else to add?" Brandon looked at me with an incredibly exhausted face and muttered in a fading voice, "I just wanted my child to grow up in a complete family with a father." It sounded nice on the surface, but I knew all too well that his definition of a complete family and mine were entirely different. We had been standing on parallel lines, unable to understand each other from the very beginning. As we were leaving the courthouse, Brandon followed me. This time, he didn't keep his distance. He walked quickly toward me and called my name, Natalie. I stopped and looked back. His voice had sunk to the very bottom. I never wanted things to end in such a catastrophe. I replied, "Things were a catastrophe a long time ago. You just hit it." He let out a deep sigh. "I know I did wrong, but I don't want to lose my child too." I stared straight into his eyes and said, "You aren't losing a child. You're just losing the power to control someone else's life however you please." He couldn't argue back. It seemed he had finally realized, perhaps for the first time in his life, that the situation was completely out of his control. I didn't say another word. I turned around and walked toward the parking lot where my dad was waiting. My dad didn't ask about the outcome. He just said shortly, "Good job. Let's go home." I nodded, feeling that I had safely crossed one of the most important hurdles on my path. Looking out the car window on the ride back, my heart felt lighter, just like the passing trees. I still had paperwork to finish, but at least I was no longer a weak existence tossed around by someone else's whims. But that very night, a person I thought I would never cross paths with again came looking for me. And she didn't just bring new information, she completely blew up the final truth that Brandon and his family had desperately tried to bury. That truth was enough to shatter the very last ounce of their shamelessness. Late that night, after the baby had fallen asleep, I was leaning against the headboard, resting my tired body, when I heard someone cautiously calling out from past the front gate. It wasn't loud, but the fact that someone was here at this hour told my instincts to check outside. Under the dim glow of the porch light stood a woman. It was Allison, the woman I had spoken with on the phone days ago, the mother of my husband's secret 3-year-old child. She looked thin, her face devoid of makeup and looking haggard, but her eyes held a firm resolve, explaining why she had come all this way in the middle of the night. I opened the door and brought her to the porch without asking any questions. My mom, coming out of the kitchen, was startled by the late-night guest, but when I briefly explained, she just nodded and went into the bedroom to watch the baby, giving us privacy. At first, a suffocating awkwardness hung in the air. We shared the same wound of a husband's betrayal, yet we were also walking reminders of each other's pain. She looked at me for a moment before getting straight to the point. "I didn't come to cause trouble." I nodded. "I know." She let out a long breath, like dropping a heavy burden. "Before the divorce gets even messier, there's one more thing you absolutely need to know. That's why I came." Her voice maintained a cold calmness, unagitated, which told me what she was about to say wasn't some petty gossip. I waited silently for her to continue. She looked down at her hands resting on her lap and spoke very slowly. "The child between Brandon and me isn't his first secret child." My heart plummeted. My breath hitched, but I kept my eyes fixed on her without interrupting. When she looked up, her gaze didn't waver an inch. Even before he met me, he lived with another woman, and he had a child with her too. But the Preston family paid her a massive settlement to quietly pack up and disappear. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just shock, it was absolute disgust at the realization that their deception went so far beyond anything I had imagined. I asked in a trembling voice, "Are you sure about this?" She nodded. "Yes. It all happened right around the time I started dating Brandon. I saw it all happen." Her voice held no resentment or anger. She was just dryly stating facts from the past. But that bizarre calmness made the weight of her story even more horrifying. I lost my words for a few seconds. In my head, the scattered pieces fell into place to form a nauseating truth. Brandon's betrayal wasn't a one-time temptation or a mistake. It was a deeply ingrained, repeated habit. And his family, with their money and hypocrisy, were accomplices who covered up his filth and pushed me into this muddy swamp of a marriage. Allison lowered her voice. "I didn't come here to hurt you more with this awful story. I just hope you don't play into those people's sickening lies anymore." I looked at her. For the first time, the invisible wall between us crumbled. It was the desperate solidarity of two women thrown away in the face of the same truth. I asked, "Then what are you going to do now?" She shook her head. "I have zero intention of going back to him. I'm only going to think about my son's future." She looked at me and added, "And you have so much more of your life left to live." Those words struck me hard. I wasn't the only one who needed to escape this hellish relationship. There was another woman just as hurt as I was, but she didn't even have the legal standing to slap him with divorce papers and walk out proudly like I did. This realization solidified my resolve. This was beyond just myself. It was my duty as a mother to ensure my child didn't grow up in the chains of such a deceitful, sick family. After she left, I sat alone on the porch for a long time. I didn't cry or panic. I simply reviewed every detail, every word, every fake action Brandon and my mother-in-law had shown me over the past 3 years with a cold, analytical mind. What I knew was only the tip of the iceberg. If I hadn't taken the first step to leave, I would have lived my entire life as a puppet in their filthy play. The next morning, I called Brandon. Not to ask, but to confirm. He answered the phone, sounding exhausted. "You called." I cut off the pleasantries. "Before Allison's kid, there was another kid with another woman, and your family paid her off to keep quiet. Is that true?" Another long silence stretched across the line. A silence that gave me the answer without him even speaking. Finally, a small, pained sound escaped his lips, like a wounded animal. Who? Who told you that?" I snapped back coldly. "It doesn't matter who told me. Just tell me if it's true or not." A few seconds later, he muttered as if giving up. "Yeah." That one word ended it all. There was nothing left to protect, no reason to hesitate. I didn't add anything else. "Got it," I said, and hung up the phone. His pathetic excuses weren't even worth hearing. I went into the room and looked down at the angelic face of my sleeping baby. My heart grew harder than ever. No matter how ugly the past was, my child's future was entirely in my hands. I would not pass down a garbage life filled with lies and deception to my baby. But this ultimate revelation didn't just make me stronger. It backed Brandon's entire family into a corner with nowhere left to hide. And this event led to a gathering of the elders from both families, setting the stage for a final showdown where no more camouflage was possible. 2 days after I learned the whole truth and my emotions had fully shifted to cold reason, my dad got a call from Brandon's family. It was a request for the two families to officially meet and settle things. Not a personal visit or a messy phone call, but a formal meeting with the head of their family, Great Uncle Charles, to cleanly resolve the issue. My dad listened silently, set a time and place, and hung up. Then he looked at me and said briefly, "Let's see how they play this until the bitter end." In his quiet words, I sensed there would be absolutely no room for compromise at this meeting. The next afternoon, we drove to Great Uncle Charles's sprawling estate. At first, I hadn't wanted to go, but my dad said, "This is your battle. You need to sit there with your head held high." Leaving the baby with my mom, I got into the passenger seat of my dad's car. On the way there, I felt no fear or tension. I just felt like a passenger heading toward an inevitable destination. There were already a lot of people in Great Uncle Charles's grand living room. Mrs. Preston, Uncle Henry, a few other older relatives, and Brandon, sitting in the corner with his head hung low. As I walked in, countless eyes pinned onto me. Curiosity, blame, observation. I ignored them all, offered a polite greeting, and sat up straight next to my dad. Great Uncle Charles, the patriarch of the family, opened with a heavy voice. "The reason both families have gathered today is to stop dragging out the issues between these two young people and to tie up loose ends without hurting each other." He looked at me and asked, "Natalie, is your mind still set on divorce?" Without a moment of hesitation, I nodded. "Yes, nothing has changed." At my short, firm answer, the air in the room instantly froze. Mrs. Preston couldn't hold back and snapped. "She's sitting there carrying so much venom. How can we even have a conversation?" Great Uncle Charles raised a hand to silence her and turned to Brandon. "What do you want to do, Brandon?" Brandon slowly lifted his head. He glanced at me, then answered in a weak voice, "I don't want a divorce." His voice carried none of his past arrogance. It just reeked of cowardice trying to avoid the situation. I showed no reaction. Great Uncle Charles nodded and continued, "If you don't want a divorce, there must be a valid reason, and we must bring everything that happened into the light." Those words were like a judge's ruling, pulling everyone's attention to Brandon. Brandon stayed silent for a few seconds before he started making excuses in an exhausted, cracked voice. "I know I was wrong. I admit it all. But I thought I could fix it." Before his pathetic excuses could go on, I didn't wait for anyone to ask me. Staring straight ahead, I spoke clearly. His mistake wasn't just a one-time slip-up. The murmuring in the living room was instantly doused with cold water. I didn't stop. My voice was level and calm, but it held a glacial chill. Before marrying me, Brandon lived with at least 2 other women and had children with both of them, and Mrs. Preston here, along with the rest of this family, knew everything. You used your money to shut them up, and then you dragged me into this family as a cover. The moment my words ended, the living room literally flipped upside down. A few of the older relatives gasped and looked at each other in horror, while those who already knew couldn't even lift their heads. Mrs. Preston's face turned beet red as she jumped to her feet. "What kind of insane garbage are you spewing in front of the elders?" But I didn't even look at her. I kept my eyes locked on Great-Uncle Charles. I have the evidence and witnesses to prove everything, and Brandon has already admitted it to me himself. All eyes shot back to Brandon. He didn't deny it. He just buried his face in his hands. His silence proved that my bombshell was the absolute truth. The air in the room was crushing. Great-Uncle Charles let out a deep sigh and lamented lowly. "How could you all hide something so disgraceful from the family for so long?" He wasn't yelling at anyone specific, but everyone felt the weight of the blame. It wasn't just Brandon's fault. The entire family who covered up this trashy behavior were accomplices. Mrs. Preston couldn't yell anymore and collapsed back into her seat. Her face was rigid, unable to look at anything. I spoke up again, not to criticize them, but to put the final period on this hellish chapter. I didn't come here today to fight or argue. I came to clearly explain to everyone exactly why I cannot stay in this marriage. My voice had no anger or trembling. Even I was surprised by the sheer cold logic that remained. Great-Uncle Charles nodded heavily. "I understand exactly what you mean." He turned to my father. "Sir, what is your family's stance?" My dad answered immediately, short and firm. "We fully respect our daughter's decision." With that one sentence, the entire situation was terminated. There was no room left for persuasion or compromise to squeeze through. Brandon finally looked up and begged in a hoarse voice, "Natalie, please don't let it end like this." I looked right at him. There wasn't a drop of love or hate left in my eyes. "I didn't choose this situation. Your lies dragged us here." He couldn't say another word, freezing with his fists clenched tightly on his knees. After a brief silence, Great-Uncle Charles handed down the conclusion. "If you two truly cannot live together, then settle it legally. No one can force this." He turned a stern glare onto Brandon. "And you will bear the full consequences for the sins you've committed." That booming reprimand was the final line of this tedious, sickening play. The meeting ended in a horrifying silence. As I stood up and walked out, no one tried to stop me. Only Brandon stood up, but he couldn't step past the living room threshold. It seemed he finally realized that the abyss between us could never be crossed again. On the drive home, the cool breeze blowing through the passenger window brushed against my face. The heavy blockage in my chest felt completely washed away, not because I was happy, but because the entire truth had been dragged out into the light. There was nothing left to hide, nothing left to suppress. All that was left was to go through the legal motions and shred the paperwork binding us together. But just when I thought everything was over, an unexpected last-minute twist occurred regarding my child's custody. It was the catalyst that made me keep my cool and deliver the final blow, forcing everyone who had ever looked down on me to wave the white flag. After the meeting at the estate, I believed everything was smoothly heading toward divorce. The other side had yielded to the truth, so I thought they couldn't fight back anymore. But just 3 days later, in the late afternoon while I was giving the baby a bath, the family court mediator called again. Brandon's side had submitted an additional motion regarding custody. The contents went beyond simply asking for custody. They had submitted real estate deeds and massive financial portfolios in Mrs. Preston's name to prove their economic superiority, demanding a full reevaluation of my ability to provide for the child. It was a ridiculous, baseless move. Hanging up the phone and looking down at my baby blinking quietly in the tub, my heart dropped. Not because I was afraid of losing him. It was because I realized that, like a cornered rat biting a cat, my in-laws had weaponized their wealth to start a cheap, dirty, mudslinging war. That night, I sat with my parents in the living room to discuss our strategy. The mood was far heavier than usual. My dad listened to my explanation, his expression unchanging, and said lowly, "If they push with money, we need to prepare our shield." My mom, looking incredibly worried, asked if we should hire a high-profile lawyer immediately. I nodded. I realized that morality and emotions weren't enough. I needed to arm myself and my child with the language of the law. The next morning, I went to a well-known family law attorney in town, a contact of my dad's. I spilled everything I knew, from the pregnancy and birth to Brandon's 2 secret kids. The lawyer took meticulous notes. Pushing up his glasses, he said, "Legally, the fault is entirely on your husband, and your position is highly favorable. But if the opposing side is playing the wealth and environment card, we need to counter with flawless documentation proving your capability." His words were clear. No matter how morally right I was, if I couldn't prove it on paper, I couldn't convince a judge. Returning home, I went straight to work. Employment verification from the furniture plant, income statements, sworn affidavits from my parents regarding childcare support, and call logs and text screenshots proving Brandon had neglected me and the baby throughout the pregnancy. I prepared everything, vowing not to leave a single loophole. For the first time in my life, I stood at the front lines of a bloody war solely to protect my child. While I was deep into gathering documents one late afternoon, Brandon suddenly showed up at my parents' gate. This time, he was alone, no Mrs. Preston, no Uncle Henry. When I opened the gate, he stared at me for a long time. The forced arrogance from his last visit was replaced by deep exhaustion and desperation. He opened his mouth, his voice hoarse. "Can we talk?" I didn't let him inside. I stood my ground, maintaining a distance between the gate and the yard. He glanced around before forcing the words out. "The custody battle. Can you please drop it?" I shook my head instantly. "Absolutely not." He sighed deeply, pleading. "I never knew things would get this catastrophic." I fired back coldly. "You are the one who drove it to a catastrophe." That wasn't an insult. It was an undeniable fact he couldn't dispute. He stayed silent for a moment before finally revealing his true intentions. "If you really refuse to come back to me, at least let me raise the child." That wasn't a request for compromise. It was blatant greed. I stared at him and asked, "Why should you be the one to raise him?" He hurriedly answered, "Because he's my kid." I smiled, a freezing smile. He's my kid too, but from the moment he was born until now, the person who has been by his side is me, not you. Unable to argue, he dropped his head and mumbled, "I can really change." With a mind clearer than ever, stripped of all past attachments, I answered, "I don't care if you change or not, but I am not going to use my child as a sacrifice to prove your personal growth." At that firm rejection, he couldn't say anything more. He stood there blankly for a long time before turning around and walking away in silence. His slumped shoulders were those of a defeated man who had entirely lost control over his life. After that day, I never left my baby's side. Between feedings, I checked and rechecked my documents. The fear that a single moment of carelessness could make my child a victim of the adult's filthy war became the fuel that kept me going. On the day the supplementary documents were due, I went to the courthouse with my dad and handed a thick stack of papers to the clerk. She reviewed them meticulously, nodded, and said, "Your paperwork is perfectly prepared." That single sentence made me feel like I could finally breathe. It was the relief of knowing I hadn't left myself defenseless. But just when I thought I was fully prepared, an unexpected variable popped up, one that would end the custody battle in a single strike. And this variable wasn't about me and Brandon. It was a grave the Preston family had dug for themselves by trying to show off their wealth, a trap that was now tightening around their own necks. 2 days after submitting the documents, while I was walking the baby in the yard, the lawyer I hired called me urgently. Unlike his usual calm demeanor, his voice was rushed and heavy. He told me that Brandon's side had secretly reached out to his office through mutual connections. The massive financial affidavit and asset portfolio Mistress Preston had submitted to prove her wealth was the root of the problem. The lawyer laid out the facts dryly. The opposing side laid out all their assets to prove their financial superiority. But within those real estate holdings and cash flows, we found a large amount of assets with untraceable sources. If the IRS audits this, they will absolutely be nailed for tax evasion and hiding assets in shell accounts. The moment I heard that, I realized why they had made such an aggressive, reckless move with their money. Blinded by their own arrogance, they overlooked the fact that their illegal wealth building could be caught on the court's radar during a lawsuit. I calmly asked, "So what happens now?" He answered carefully, "If this becomes a focal point in the trial, it won't just be about losing custody. The entire Preston family could face massive tax fraud penalties or even criminal charges. Then he added, "But Natalie, don't leak this to the press or the public first. Let's just use it to secure custody and your divorce." Hanging up, I stood in the middle of the yard for a long time. The baby's soft breathing warmed my back. Instead of feeling triumphant, I felt a profound sense of hollowness. Their vulgar greed trying to cover and solve everything with money had become the very noose around their necks. I promised myself I wouldn't lose sight of the core issue just for revenge. My only goal was to hold my child safely and cut ties with this wretched family forever. Late that afternoon, the doorbell rang. It wasn't Brandon or Mrs. Preston. It was Uncle Henry. He arrived alone, stepping into the yard with a very grim expression. I guided him to the porch. My dad, who was inside, nodded and stepped out back, giving us space to talk privately. Uncle Henry stared at me, cleared his throat as if swallowing his pride, and got straight to the point. "Natalie, I know you've prepared for this lawsuit very thoroughly." I didn't deny it. "Yes, I have." He let out a heavy sigh and continued. "I'll be honest. If this custody battle goes to trial and everything gets dragged out, it won't just be Brandon taking a hit. Our entire family will suffer massive damages." It wasn't a threat. It was virtually a declaration of surrender. Faced with the exposure of their dirty money, they were finally tucking their tails between their legs. I replied calmly. I never intended to blow things out of proportion from the start. I was only trying to protect my child. Uncle Henry nodded, trying to negotiate. "I know Brandon was wrong 1,000 times over, but digging this all up won't do you any good either." I almost laughed out loud, not out of remorse, but out of fear that their assets would be seized. They came crawling to beg for a settlement. The sheer vulgarity of it gave me goosebumps. I thought for a moment. I could blow the whistle on their illegal assets and ruin them. But if I did, the mudslinging would drag on for years, and my child would have to grow up in the center of a vicious legal war. In a firm, clear voice, I said, "I don't want to ruin anyone. My demand has been the same from the beginning. Give me sole legal and physical custody of the child." Uncle Henry was silent for a moment before answering in resignation. "Understood. If you agree to keep the financial matters quiet, we will drop the custody lawsuit entirely. In return, please just allow Brandon to have regular visitation rights." In that moment, I realized I had won a complete and total victory. The people who swore they could never give up the child had tossed away the Preston bloodline they claimed to value so much the second their money was threatened. I stared right into his eyes and asked, "Are you absolutely certain?" He nodded heavily. "I promise you, on my honor as the head of this family." His tone left no room for any more tricks or backtracking. I stood in place silently until Uncle Henry got up and walked out the gate. The exit to this endlessly dark tunnel was finally clear in front of my eyes. But to fully escape, I still had one last piece of paperwork to hammer down myself. Over the next few days, I took my time drafting a flawless settlement agreement with my lawyer. Without letting emotions take over, I used the coldest, most rational logic to create an airtight legal safety net for my child's future. Alimony and child support were set to the maximum allowed by state law, and visitation rights were strictly limited to times and locations of my choosing. The afternoon my lawyer delivered the final settlement to Brandon, he called me. His voice was empty, devoid of the forced persuasion or resentment from the past. "I agree to everything in the settlement." I replied shortly, "Okay, see you in court." Any further conversation was meaningless. That dry silence was the most perfect period to end our relationship. Finally, the day of the final mediation arrived. I went to the family court wearing no makeup, dressed in my simplest, neatest clothes. I wanted to stand proudly as my true self, without any fake packaging or pretense. In the courthouse hallway, Brandon looked like he had aged 10 years in a few days. He stared blankly at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. The final procedure before the judge went swiftly. Thanks to the perfectly negotiated settlement agreement, there was no room for debate or disagreement. The judge read the final terms regarding custody, asset division, and child support, then asked us to sign. As I picked up the pen and wrote my name on the signature line, tears suddenly welled up from deep inside me, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming liberation of knowing I had rescued my suffocating self with my own 2 hands. As I walked out of the courtroom, Brandon followed me out and cautiously called my name, "Natalie." I stopped and looked back. There was no lingering attachment or false hope left in his eyes. He bowed his head deeply and spoke in a trembling voice. "I'm sorry. I am so, so sorry." It was an apology that came far too late, but I didn't get angry or throw sarcastic remarks at him. I just gave a single, silent nod and turned my back, walking away without hesitation. No matter how sincere an apology is, you can't glue a shattered piece of glass back together. After that day, my life slowly found a new, stable rhythm. I'm preparing to return to my bookkeeping job at the furniture plant, raising my child with my mom's help. The path of a working single mom isn't easy, but a life free from the suffocating surveillance of my in-laws and the deception of my husband feels like peaceful breathing. The unwavering presence of my parents is the true warmth of family I had never once felt during my 3 years of marriage. As agreed, Brandon comes to our town twice a month to see the baby. He never steps foot inside the gate. He sits on the porch, holds the baby, and exactly when his time is up, he hands him back and leaves. We both know that this strict boundary, leaving no room for unnecessary words or messy emotional residue, is the safest and most perfect relationship for us now. One clear afternoon, while I was pushing the stroller through the neighborhood, my mom walking beside me asked cautiously, "Natalie, do you ever regret your decision?" I stopped walking and looked down at my baby, smiling like an angel in the stroller. I gave a bright smile and answered, "Never, Mom, not for a single second." My mom didn't ask anymore and just smiled comfortably. Things in life don't always go the way we want, but when we stand at the most painful edge of a cliff, our destiny is decided by whether we can grab hold of cold reason to protect ourselves. I used to live in the foolish illusion that if I just endured and was patient, everything would turn out okay. But what saved me wasn't endless compromise. It was the courage and resolve to cut out the rotting flesh. If someone asked me what I was thinking the day I was discharged from the hospital, when I refused to get in my husband's car and walked out the front doors, my answer is very simple. I just chose to return to the place where I belonged, and it was exactly at that moment that my real life began again. Not as a foolish daughter-in-law holding her breath under her in-laws' scrutiny, but as a strong mother who knows how to protect herself and her child. The story of this woman named Natalie does not end as a tragedy of a broken marriage. It is the brilliant survival story of an ordinary, fragile woman who didn't let herself get swept up in revenge or madness, but protected her rights and her child using the most rational and calculated methods. Many people facing the same hellish dilemma as Natalie ignore the truth and endure the pain just to maintain the facade of a family or out of fear of how society will view them. But a family built on one-sided deception and shamelessness can never truly be whole. Brandon and his family blindly believed they could cover up the truth with their reputation and wealth. They mistook paying off affairs and secret children as parental love, ignoring the fact that it was a criminal betrayal against a daughter-in-law. But that rotten arrogance ultimately turned them into the most miserable losers. There are no winners or losers in this story. There is only the bone-chilling lesson left behind after a brutal hurricane has swept through. The foundation of a marriage is mutual respect and honesty. A relationship where these two things collapse is bound to crumble like a sandcastle. If you find yourself stuck in a hellish dilemma like Natalie right now, do not act hastily based purely on boiling emotions. Cool your head, gather the evidence, and prepare perfectly to stand on your own. There is no need to offer endless patience to people who trample on your worth, because you are not so insignificant that you deserve to be used as a prop or a shield in anyone else's life. I sincerely hope that Natalie's story can be a cold, powerful ray of light for someone suffering in the dark, guiding them to take back their own life.